The contemporary social apparatus consistently propagates a profound misconception regarding the core mechanics of structural authority. The populace is systematically conditioned to believe that genuine dominance manifests through highly visible vehicles, institutional titles, public validation, and the loudest, most aggressive voice in a crowded room. This perspective is fundamentally flawed. Geopolitical and behavioral history demonstrates that the most inherently dangerous individual in any structural ecosystem is never the one commanding the spotlight. Rather, it is the quiet observer who operates with surgical psychological detachment, mapping the vulnerabilities of the room and calculating strategic maneuvers several moves ahead while those around him merely react to immediate stimuli. Society actively encourages individuals to chase superficial visibility, to perform, and to loudly announce their presence and ambitions to the collective. However, sustainable power, the specific architecture of influence that cannot be stripped away by shifting institutional tides, functions exclusively within the realm of complete tactical silence. Niccolò Machiavelli recognized this core reality when analyzing the brittle nature of statecraft. The sovereign who rules with the loudest public display often accelerates his own demise, whereas the unseen hand that shapes underlying outcomes never loses its grip on the apparatus of control. This framework represents a cold, clinical breakdown of how structural influence is engineered, sustained, and insulated from exposure, without ever leaving a traceable signature back to the architect. The fundamental mistake made by nearly every individual pursuing systemic power is the fatal conflation of public visibility with actual operational control. In their desperate hunger for accolades, formal status, and public applause, they inadvertently present their adversaries with a comprehensive diagnostic map of everything they value and everything they fear losing. The historical record is littered with the remnants of visible leaders who made themselves too loud, too predictable, and too easily analyzed by their contemporaries. Monarchs who demanded absolute public fealty were often the first to be subverted in private chambers, and generals who celebrated their victories too openly routinely found their logistics undermined in silence. The public throne remains the most precarious and hazardous seat in any organization, not because of the administrative demands it imposes, but because of the vulnerability it exposes. Sitting within the spotlight provides competitors with a stable, stationary target to analyze, allowing them to map every psychological pattern, emotional vulnerability, and behavioral trigger over time. Conversely, the individual positioned deliberately within the shadows evades this continuous surveillance. Because his presence is not actively registered, no countermeasures are designed against him, and no competitors recognize the necessity of preparing for his eventual maneuvers. As Machiavelli noted, the vast majority of mankind is governed almost entirely by superficial appearances rather than reality, leaving the silent strategist free to manipulate the underlying mechanisms of the environment, while others manage their public performances. True silence must not be misconstrued as emptiness, passivity, or an underlying absence of operational capability. It is the dense, intentional space where long-term power is constructed brick by brick, away from hostile observation. The average individual harbors an intense psychological aversion to silence because it strips away external noise, forcing an unfiltered confrontation with internal capability. To alleviate this anxiety, they speak excessively, over-explain their motivations, justify their lateral movements, and prematurely broadcast their long-term ambitions to anyone who will listen. In doing so, they systematically forfeit every inherent strategic advantage before the competitive game even begins, rendering their positions highly vulnerable to interception. The individual who masters absolute verbal restraint operates on an entirely advanced tier of structural influence, using silence as a net positive resource accumulator. Machiavelli understood that premium information functions as the true baseline currency of structural control, and deliberate silence is the primary vehicle used to accumulate this currency without expending political capital. When an individual refuses to fill the conversational void, human nature drives others to eagerly step into the silence, inadvertently exposing their deepest insecurities, hidden alliances, and covert agendas. Silence serves as a sophisticated psychological trap, disguised as passive disinterest, allowing the strategist to catalog critical intelligence while maintaining complete emotional and analytical composure. A foundational principle of deep influence rests on the realization that the most absolute forms of manipulation are completely imperceptible to the target. No individual willingly views themselves as a puppet. Those who are directed, conditioned, and silently managed by a superior intellect typically go to their graves believing they acted entirely on their own volition. The invisible strategist eschews overt force in favor of systemic environmental conditioning, meticulously arranging external circumstances so that the target naturally arrives at the predetermined conclusion on their own. This methodology shifts human behavior away from rational, logical deduction, recognizing that individuals are primarily emotional creatures who utilize logic merely to justify emotional impulses after the fact. The veteran strategist avoids targeting weak individuals, recognizing that unstable personalities are highly unpredictable and prone to sudden structural collapse under external pressure. Instead, the most viable targets for long-term alignment are proud, overly ambitious individuals who possess an intense psychological need to validate their status to the peer group. Pride represents the most accessible behavioral lever to manipulate. Validating a proud man's ego ensures his unwavering compliance, while subtly challenging his perceived identity can drive him to dismantle his own alliances to prove a superficial point. By positioning oneself as the quiet arbiter of the target's validation and status, the strategist establishes a profound psychological dependency that alters the target's behavior without triggering resentment. There exists a vast operational chasm between strategic invisibility and being systematically ignored by an environment. The latter stems from a total lack of social weight, while the former is an engineered masterpiece of discretion. The strategically invisible actor treats his absence from the spotlight with the exact same precision that a chess grandmaster applies to a multi-move endgame sequence. He recognizes that overexposure breeds familiarity, and familiarity inevitably renders an individual's behavior patterns highly predictable to competitors. By intentionally restricting his visibility and appearing only when it yields a distinct structural advantage, the strategist cultivates an aura of mystique that triggers an automatic anxious projection from those around him. Human psychology is naturally designed to fear the unreadable and fill structural blanks with worst-case scenarios, meaning that an adversary's imagination will almost always paint a more formidable picture than reality. This atmospheric uncertainty forces compliance and caution from the surrounding peer group, compelling them to weigh their words carefully and second-guess their tactical movements. Strategic invisibility grants an individual absolute sovereignty over the narrative of their own identity, preventing the external world from defining their boundaries through reactive public interactions. The invisible hand curates every single touchpoint with cold calculation, displaying calculated warmth to cement loyalty, calculated humility to disarm suspicion, and absolute stillness when silence yields the greatest return. The weakest, most fragile iteration of authority is that which relies on constant, loud reinforcement. A manager who micromanages or a leader who barks public orders merely broadcasts an underlying terror of non-compliance. Real control is embedded directly into the environment, the institutional culture, and the unspoken structural rules that dictate human behavior long before any direct interaction takes place. The highest tier of influence does not involve managing what individuals do, but rather dictating the frame of what they believe is possible, acceptable, or expected within that ecosystem. When the strategist successfully constructs the operational frame, he completely bypasses the need for overt commands, as the environment itself enforces his structural will. A prince who rules solely through the explicit fear of physical or administrative punishment remains permanently vulnerable to a sudden, unified rebellion when the cost of compliance outweighs the fear of retribution. However, the strategist who successfully shapes the underlying values and assumptions of his subordinates rules with zero visible friction, as the individuals actively police themselves to remain aligned with the established framework. The frame consists of the invisible matrix of assumptions that dictate everyday human interactions, a matrix that the average person never thinks to question. By establishing the baseline definition of what is considered normal early in the life cycle of an organization, The invisible hand commands the group's direction without ever triggering their natural psychological resistance to authority. No strategist, regardless of his individual discipline, intellectual capacity, or level of discretion, can project meaningful power in complete isolation. Authority is fundamentally a network phenomenon. The archetype of the isolated, self-sufficient lone wolf is a dangerous strategic delusion that creates a hard ceiling on an individual's operational capacity. The invisible hand views power as a complex architecture of interconnected relationships, strategic dependencies, and mutual obligations that multiply individual capability. Machiavelli emphasized that a sovereign who relies exclusively on his independent physical strength remains inherently fragile, whereas one who anchors himself within a web of individuals who require his success for their own survival creates an unassailable system. This invisible network is constructed not through grand public declarations, but through thousands of microtransactions of strategic generosity, quiet problem-solving, and the deliberate accumulation of unreciprocated favors. Within the subterranean economy of long-term influence, a well-timed, unasked-for favor delivered to a critical node carries vastly more leverage than a formal binding contract. Favors generate implicit psychological obligation, obligation breeds long-term compliance, and compliance builds a human infrastructure that protects the strategist's interests, even when he is completely absent from the room. The objective is to engineer a system where the network prospers directly through its alignment with the strategist, rendering any act of betrayal an act of self-destruction for the collaborator. While Machiavelli famously noted that it is historically safer for a prince to be feared rather than loved, the modern invisible hand refines this principle by removing the human face from the threat. Overt, visible terror gives adversaries a concrete target to study, wait out, and eventually organize a rebellion against. When men know exactly where their anxiety originates, they can build collective courage to dismantle the source. The strategist employs an ambient, low-frequency uncertainty that settles into the psychology of the environment, keeping individuals off balance without allowing them to pinpoint the source of the pressure. This faceless reputation is established through a small number of quiet, decisive, and perfectly timed counters to disrespect, creating narratives that naturally propagate through the peer group. Once a definitive narrative is established regarding the inevitable consequences of crossing the invisible hand, the environment automatically self-censors, saving the strategist from ever having to repeat the demonstration. This faceless authority transforms the strategist into the ultimate wildcard variable in every calculation made by his contemporaries, ensuring a high degree of deference and strategic caution across the board. Furthermore, this entire ecosystem requires zero ongoing energy to maintain once the initial psychological architecture is anchored. The caution, respect, and compliance of the group sustain themselves automatically through sheer self-preservation. The ultimate destruction of a powerful position almost always traces back to a short-sighted approach to strategy. Short-game actors burn their energy on immediate visibility and aggressive, premature consolidations that exhaust their resources. The shadow player completely divorces his sense of personal progress from the need for immediate public validation, training his intellect to find profound satisfaction in the quiet, incremental anchoring of an unassailable position. This long game of shadows demands absolute ego death, forcing the strategist to accept that his most significant investments today may not yield visible leverage for months or even years down the line. His strategy remains completely hidden within his daily routine, his ambition masked by flawless composure, and his forward progress obscured by total superficial stillness. The ultimate resolution of the shadow path arrives at a critical threshold, where the unseen architecture must inevitably manifest into the material world, representing a state of absolute, unassailable completion. When the architect finally chooses to pull back the curtain on the structures he has spent years building in quiet isolation, the surrounding environment discovers that the operational trap is already completely sprung. At this advanced juncture, mounting a coherent counter-strategy becomes an exercise in self-destruction, as the network's dependencies are too deeply woven into the very fabric of the infrastructure. The outside world invariably misinterprets this flawless shift as a stroke of sudden genius, remaining entirely blind to the patient, multi-dimensional design that made your emergence an absolute mathematical inevitability.